Hello and welcome back. So let's finish up the video series on holocrons and their legacy by tracing holocrons kind of down through history. Now I mentioned that Sith holocrons, or that holocron technology, was essentially a Sith legacy. The Jedis were kind of knockoffs, and that it spans a great period of history, but even over thousands and thousands, like 28,000 years or more, there were relatively few holocrons, which is why they were extremely sought after. So before we get into this, I just wanted to stress one more time that the holocrons, as they exist in legends, were an instrument of tradition. They were a grab for immortality and for legacy, and this legacy operated in the shadows to preserve the Sith through the ages. They were also a tool of revolution. If you were just doing the thing that the Sith before you didn't need a holocron, you could just use theirs. But when you started to do something different, or when you fundamentally changed the way that the Sith functioned, then you needed a holocron. Then you needed to add to the legacy, because these are blips in the timeline of the Sith. Alright, so that out of the way, let's start at the beginning. The holocrons came from the Rakata, and this is something that was changed in the canon. In the new canon, rather, when Disney took over, they changed it from the Rakata to the Dai Bendu, and the Dai Bendu were basically like old school Force monks, and they basically attributed holocrons to them. In old legends, it was the Rakata. It was a dark side origin. And so the Rakata holocrons were dark side focusing tools, and these things were prehistory up through about 28,000 before Battle of Yavin. The Rakata colonized the Sith homeworld, and one of the things that they did as sort of an outreach was they taught Addis, the king of the Sith, how to make a holocron. They passed on this technology. Now Addis was supposed to help them colonize and help them rule, but secretly Addis was rebelling against them. He was amassing their technology, he was appropriating it, and he was preparing to free his homeworld from Rakata influence. So the original holocrons were Rakata holocrons. And then that information was passed to the first Sith holocron, which was the holocron of Darth Addis, or Lord Addis, rather, of the Sith race. Now, this holocron, Addis, is 27,700 before Battle of Yavin, and this is sort of how things existed in prehistory. There was no reason to create more holocrons because the Sith overthrew the Rakata, and the Sith race basically was like a war race, and so there was no reason to put any more benchmarks in there. This holocron, by the way, pops back up much later. I talk about this sort of resurfacing legacy. This holocron pops back up with Lumia down after the Battle of Yavin, back leading up to Darth Caedus or Jacen Solo becoming a Dark Lord. Lumia was his teacher, and one of the artifacts that she obtained that allowed her to become a powerful player in the absence of the Empire was the holocron of Darth Addis. Alright, so Addis created his, and then the holocron technology kind of goes to sleep for a while until you end up with the more modern Sith. The golden age of the Sith starts with these Jedi exiles, who are dark or fallen Jedi. They're basically kicked out of the Jedi Order, but they're exiled, and they go across the galaxy and they find the Sith homeworld. And the Sith treat them as leaders, welcome them as conquerors, and they set up on this sort of primal homeworld, but they start integrating some of this dark side legacy that the actual Sith race had. So there were a few of these guys. There was Ajunta Pal, the leader. There was Karnus Mull. There was Zozan and Sorza Sin, and a few others. Ajunta Pal was the leader, but he didn't. There's no evidence that he ever made a holocron. He was more of a speaker and a doer and a person of action. He was interested in the power and in becoming a king or ruling over these people. The sort of mystics that were there in the background were people like Karnus Mur, rather, who didn't make a holocron either. Mur made the Mur talisman that you see in all over the place in the Dark Horse comics. That was his sort of forte, was relics of that sort. The holocron makers, the people who took this Sith tradition and ran with it, there were two of them. Zozan was one of them, and Sorza Sin was the other. So basically these two characters, Sorza Sin is the one who wrote the Sith code. Shows up in the Book of the Sith and pretty much nowhere else. Zozan shows up as the person who turns Darth Krayt to the dark side and makes him a Sith Lord using her holocron thousands of years later. So the Swords of Sin holocron, which I have here, Swords of Sin was a mystic and an alchemist and a Sith sorcerer. So this sort of stuff appealed to him. And this holocron was passed down later to Darth Sidious, along with the technology of holocrons in general. So, Swords of Sin created a holocron, and Zozan created a much different looking holocron. And so the technology starts to sort of become more individual to the people who create it. The Rakata holocrons probably all looked very similar. And again, both of these holocrons pop up much later. All right. Now, not only mystics made holocrons, but sometimes those with enough power in the dark side to accomplish the job and something else to say did as well. So Tulak Hord was probably the last holocron that was made in the golden age of the Sith. So this is around the same time, which is around 6,900 before Battle of Yavin, 7,000 before Battle of Yavin. So it's about 7,000 years before the events of the Star Wars movies. And Tulak Hord was a warrior par excellence. He was the person who sort of pioneered Sith lightsaber combat. But he was also extremely powerful in the dark side and accomplished with preserving his essence. And his ghost pops up later down the road in Korriban, in the Valley of the Sith. So these characters stay around for a while. But Tulak Hord made his, and the person who succeeded him, Marcus Ragnus, I believe, would have used Tulak Hord's. He took the warrior elements, but he didn't really fundamentally change anything, so Tulak Hord's holocron carried the Sith legacy going forward. Alright, so with the fall of the Golden Age of the Sith, in comes the Hyperspace War. And the Hyperspace War was basically all of these different races were developing hyperspace, and they were getting to places where they couldn't get to before. And so the Sith homeworld starts to get visitors besides these original Jedi. And the Hyperspace War gave rise to a bunch of turmoil, and it gave the Sith a chance also to expand their reach across the galaxy. And so you ended up with some rather powerful players. In about 5,000, 5,200 before Battle of Yavin, you ended up with Naga Sato. Now, Naga Sato was of the Sith race, so he was on this homeworld in this dark Jedi context. The Dark Jedi came, established the Sith religion or the Sith culture on top of the Sith race, and Naga Sato kind of combined the two of them. His influence, again, reaches into Knights of the Old Republic, reaches almost into Clone Wars. Okay, but he created a holocron because basically he's the one who took the Sith race he's the one who started to take the Sith race to the stars. And his protege, or apprentice rather, Freedom Nad, also had a holocron. And so Freedom Nad's holocron, this is actually pictured in the comics, he creates a cult. He basically takes this Sith culture and turns it into a religion. Freedom Nad pops back up again as a Force ghost upon occasion, so we'll see him a little bit later down the road. But Freedom Nad is about 4,400 before Battle of Yavin, still within this sort of Sith race, Sith empire going to the stars sort of stuff. And his holocron is going to be one of the things that, again, pops up to fill in a gap, to carry the Sith legacy forward, because after Naga Sato and Freedom Nad are so successful, the Sith have a dynasty, they have a cult, and people are basically following what they did, and there wasn't any new innovation for quite a while. All right, so following Freedom Nad, we end up with this period of cult following where holocrons are not made. And then in the early Empire, we end up with Freedom Nad is dead. There aren't really any Sith Lords. There's just this sort of cult that worships the Sith Lords that used to be there. And then we end up with these two characters, Ulic Qel-Droma and Exar Kun rather. And Exar Kun is one of the first like ancient characters that was actually mentioned in old school Star Wars. They drop these weird names every so often, and then that backstory gets filled in later. And Exar Kun was a Jedi, and so was Ulic Qel-Droma. And they were basically assigned to this world, and this world was the home world where Freedon Nad existed, and that contained his cult. And as Exar Kun falls to the dark side with the help of the Force Ghost of Freedon Nad, he basically becomes appointed the new Sith Lord, and Ulic Qel-Droma becomes appointed his Sith apprentice. So Exar Kun pioneered the double-bladed lightsaber that you see with Darth Maul, and he was a major conqueror, very, very sort of haughty character who would like march into the Imperial presence and like challenge people. And his holocron was a very different creature. It was a different geometry, a different color. He used a blue lightsaber. So Exar Kun's holocron basically reshaped the Sith legacy. Had become this thing tied to the Sith race, tied to the homeworld, tied to this empire. And Exar Kun sort of took it back to this core of two, these sort of great leaders who led an empire, but they were the Sith. And this is something that you're going to see paralleled down the road with Darth Bane. So around this same time, Exar Kun is about 4,000 before Battle of Yavin, something in that neighborhood. Around this same time, we also have a lot of other things. This is beginning of the Old Republic. So this is, we ended up with Darth Adedu. Now, Darth Adedu was basically like a Sith zombie. And his holocron, the holocron of heresies, becomes very important. It gets passed down to like Dooku and Sidious and Bane and a whole bunch of others. And his holocron, actually, he was one of the ones who figured out how to not just put your essence in there, but to put your consciousness in there so that you can jump out of it and possess somebody later down the road. So the holocron of heresies was an innovation. It was a way to use the holocrons not just as here's preserving my legacy, but here's preserving me. It was bringing that reach for immortality to the next level. And this is all around the same time as the Exar Kun, about 4,000 before Battle of Yavin. Around about this same time, we also have a lot of people doing a lot of different things and a lot of innovation. We have Darth Traya around this same time. And Darth Traya sort of pops up with her own sort of nihilistic take on Sith philosophy and Jedi philosophy, and you can see that in Knights of the Old Republic 2. By Knights of the Old Republic 2, Darth Traya is much older. She's lost a hand. She pops up at the beginning, sort of in the shadows, with her own holocron, and this idea of a triumvirate that only comes to fruition after the fall of Darth Revan. Speaking of Darth Revan, we have Darth Revan. Now, Darth Revan was a major force within the Old Republic, and he found the Star Forge, and he took things back to the Rakata legacy, and he learned his holocron technology from this Rakata Star Forge, from this old school technology. So his is much more plain, and it's kind of a throwback. It's a connection with the roots, but again, it's how that technology through holocrons pops up from time to time. And whereas Traya was doing her triumvirate or rule of the three, and Exar Kun before her was doing a rule of the me, Revan started getting the seeds of this idea of a rule of the two, of concentrating your power in one spot, as opposed to having a Sith Academy where you've got tons of Sith Lords. You ended up sort of distilling that legacy down. Right? With the fall of Darth Revan, you ended up with Darth Traya being left over after the fact. So Darth Traya comes back in, Exar Kun is gone, her triumvirate idea gets a chance to sort of stretch its legs, and you end up with Darth Nihilus. And Darth Nihilus was a Force ghost. He attached his consciousness to his armor, and he didn't really have a body after his planet was dissolved. He became the Lord of Hunger, the second part of that triumvirate. So you had Darth Traya and her apprentice Darth Nihilus, and then there was a third, Darth Sion, but you notice that he doesn't have a holocron. Darth Sion would have lacked the focus for a holocron. He was the Lord of Pain, and he was about vengeance. Darth Nihilus preserved his his information, preserved his legacy because he really didn't have a lot of choice. Traya preserved it as a way of passing down this idea, these sort of revolutionary concepts about how the Sith should function. All right, so, and I built two different versions of a Darth Nihilus. This one's based off of the Darth Nihilus holocron that you see in the Legacy era comics. This one is more of a different spin on it with the triumvirate logo up there. But there's a little bit of give and take as to what they look like because you only see them in brief glimpses. All right, rounding off the Old Republic, after Traya and the triumvirate, you ended up with Darth Vitiate. Or Darth Tenebris, he had a lot of names, basically the immortal Sith Empire. And he was this really old character who had been lurking in the shadows, and then he pops up and sort of takes over the Sith Empire. And his holocron is a very different take on how things work. His holocron looks a lot more like a Jedi holocron. And Tenebris was, or Vitiate rather, was really good at that sort of living in the spotlight. This is something that Palpatine or Sidious would get later down the road. The previous Sith Lords would stroll out in all of their Sithness and their, I am your Sith leader now. Vitiate was, I am the good and benevolent leader of the Old Republic, or of the Empire. You can trust me, I'm a great guy, but secretly I'm a Sith Lord. And so it kind of makes sense that his holocron, or the holocron of shadows, would look more like a Jedi Noeticon or a Datacron. It's hiding in plain sight. But taking it in that direction, which nobody else really ever did after him. All right, so after that point, we're out of the 4000s, and holocrons take like a 2.5, 3,000 year nap. The Old Republic the Old Republic and becomes the new, or eventually becomes the New Republic, but there's this period of Vitiate and all of these strong characters had such an impact on things that there was no reason, that it was all fallout for thousands of years. And the holocron technology was hoarded and lost. There's a lot of different Sith Lords, but they were all basically focused on conquering and rising to power and taking this power that's out there for themselves, and so much infighting. And then one Sith Lord comes around, Belia Darzu, who was a shape changer. She sort of pioneered this technology of organic and machine, and sort of melding the two. And she also refined the technology of holocrons. She picked up how they were made. She wrote basically the textbook of how to make holocrons and became sort of this master artificer. Okay, Belia Darzu's holocron would have been a much more technological looking thing, kind of a steampunk vibe to it. And her holocron is later, though it's not ever pictured in the Legacy, it was later picked up by Darth Bane after the holocron technology was lost again and revived. So the Sith get so interested in other things, in conquering the galaxy and creating their empires, that holocron technology falls to one relatively minor Sith who preserves it for future generations, and it sits in this holocron. This is her doing this around 1300 before Battle of Yavin, something in that neighborhood. And then it gets picked up again 300 years later. So it takes a 300-year nap after it had just taken a couple thousand-year nap. All right. So Darth Bane was all about legacy. The rule of two, moving the Sith forward, changing things fundamentally. So it made sense that he would be very interested in figuring out, hey, there was once these things called holocrons. How do I make one of those? And Darth Bane tried for years to try to figure out how to make one, and he had so many failed attempts. It was very important to him. Eventually, he found that holocron of Belia Darzu, and he learned the process. A lot of that information that I had in the last video about how holocrons are made comes from the section of the story where Darth Bane is relearning this technology about the capstone and the crystal matrix and the rituals of commencement and invocation. So Darth Bane created his holocron, which you see again in the hands at the end of the Sith Legacy of Darth Krayt. Darth Bane's holocron contained the information about the rule of two, contained his information about dealing with parasitic armor, contained his information about the Force. And this was eventually passed down to Sidious as well. who also had Darth Bane's holocron. All right, so after Darth Bane, about 1000 before Battle of Yavin, the holocrons take another nap, because Darth Bane establishes the rule of two. The Sith go dark, and it becomes this sort of dogma of Darth Bane. This is the rule of two. You do not violate it. You need to do things exactly this way. So his holocron was like the textbook of the Sith way, until you end up with somebody who starts to question the rule of two. Now that's Darth Plagueis. Now, Darth Plagueis, the master of Darth Sidious, was interested in science and technology and midichlorians and creating life, and he was taking things in a whole different way. Instead of trying to preserve the rule of two, he didn't mind if he had like a secret apprentice or two on the side. He was okay with having there be more Sith, because Darth Plagueis was really about, how do I preserve myself, my genetics, my midichlorians, my consciousness? How do I create life that I can then put myself into? The sort of cloning and transferring of consciousness through science. So he goes back to this transfer essence idea that the Siths had before, and sort of rejects Darth Bane and adds his own spin to things. All right, Darth Plagueis, though, didn't ultimately succeed, because he was murdered by Darth Sidious in his sleep. You got that in the tragedy of Plagueis the Wise, and so this is where the Legacy era stuff and the Legends stuff, not the Legacy era, sorry, the Legends stuff starts to meet the canon and starts to be something that's mentioned in the movies. So Darth Sidious still wasn't too much interested in passing information to future generations, because Darth Sidious wanted to, like Darth Plagueis, use that information and live forever. Thing is that Darth Sidious also wanted to become, as he says in the final movie, all of the Sith. He wanted all of this legacy transferred into himself. He wanted all the way back to the Rakata. He wanted to also use clones and transfer of essence and stuff like that. So Darth Sidious made a holocron kind of out of pride. And his holocron is what the Book of the Sith comes in if you buy the keepsake. But it looks kind of like this right here. It's a different geometry. It's kind of a cross between Exar Kun's geometry and the Sith pyramid geometry. So it's basically his amalgamation of everything that came before into his holocron that uses squares and triangles and contains all of his information, because he was a prolific writer and recorder. He actually had a studio within his office at the Death Star, where he just basically worked on his holocron and worked on his legacy. All right, so Darth Sidious had a profound impact on the Sith. He took it and he concentrated it kind of into the rule of two, but he also had secret apprentices all over the place, but mostly into the power play for a concentrated centralized one Sith area. And after Darth Sidious, we're nearing the end of the legacy, or the whole legacy of holocrons. After Darth Sidious, who had all of these holocrons that still existed in his collection, Darth Sidious made his own. But then when he fell, much to his surprise, it was a time of chaos. There was infighting. There were Vader's apprentices. There were Sidious's secret apprentices. There was Lumia, who got inspiration from the Addis holocron. There was the Vong War. So basically this time of upheaval where the Sith were sort of scattered and trying to figure out how to move forward. And there were a lot of false starts. And the only one of those starts that really took root was Darth Krayt. So even with Darth Caedus, who was arguably very powerful, Darth Krayt was one of the most powerful Sith Lords. He had powers of telekinesis and to foresee the future that nobody else had to the level that he had. And Darth Krayt started out as a Jedi who survived Order 66. So he was on the opposite side of the fence when Palpatine was in power. Asherad Het, he was a Tusken. All right, so we come out of this sort of lowly place and we rise to prominence, rise to the Jedi Order. The Jedi Order falls and Darth Krayt becomes a prisoner of the Vong and gets tortured. And eventually he finds this strength with the help of one of the earlier holocrons, with the help of Zozan's gatekeeper in the holocron, or in her holocron. Darth Krayt eventually becomes a Sith Lord, becomes the dragon. and he creates his own holocron. Now, there are no pictures of this, but it's indicated in legends that he made one. There are quotes from it. But he basically tried to revitalize the Sith. He tried to create a Sith empire that could spread. Taking Palpatine's idea of concentrated power, Darth Krayt had the idea of the one Sith. There's one person at the head, but there's tons of Sith Lords, and they are all one Sith. And so he rejected the rule of two just completely and tried to create Sith Lords aplenty so that they could spread throughout the galaxy and carry Sith moving forward. Ultimately, that didn't work out for him. He ends up getting thrown into he ends up being the sort of Sith Lord who can come back from any injury and regenerate himself, and so they have to sort of crash him into a sun in order to get rid of him. But with the fall of Darth Krayt, all you're left with at the end of things is a guy called Darth Red, and Darth Red's the last Sith Lord, but he's kind of a thug who's picking things up and trying to put the pieces back together, but ultimately doesn't succeed. So it's the last sort of death throes of the Sith Empire with Darth Red, but he wouldn't have had his own holocron because he was never really successful. Darth Krayt was so successful that he destroyed Mon Calamari, so successful that he basically created this empire, but the empire didn't really outlive him, and so you end up with the final holocron in the Legacy. So, like I said, Sith holocrons, or legacy in holocrons, they are these plot devices that move the Sith forward, that preserve this information, and they are at the core, or the center, of the Legends era idea of the Sith technology. So you have peripheral holocrons, you have Jedi holocrons that were basically knockoffs, as I've mentioned. You have the great holocrons of the Jedi, or the teaching tools. There's some specific ones like the Telios Holocron, or there was one that was a 20-sided holocron that was captured, or that was separated into shards. Noeticons. And later down the road, you end up with a wayfinder, which is a holocron that's basically stripped of everything other than its ability to record one piece of information and pass it on to people who can use the Force. So it's basically like a Force lock. It's password protection on a map. So the wayfinder is this sort of last bastardized representation of a holocron. And so the technology that started with the Rakata finally dies, but it leaves behind this sort of artifact legacy that, because of the way that Star Wars works, if they did want to create future series based on this timeline, all they'd have to do is find a holocron or two, and this Sith legacy is never truly destroyed, because as long as there are holocrons, it can pop back up anywhere, anytime, in various types of shapes based off of where it's been and what's been tried. So hopefully this last video was really long, but it was a lot of material. Hopefully this video series has been of interest to you guys, and this sort of scratches the itch that you guys have of getting a little bit more Star Wars lore. After this, I'm going to go back to some more reviews and performance videos, but if you want to see more stuff like this, please let me know, and again, it'll plant that seed in the back of my mind until something else comes up. Hopefully you've enjoyed. See you next time.